Hi and welcome back to my channel, and in today's episode I'm going to be showing you how to knit for beginners. And there's three parts to this tutorial today. So I'm going to show you how to do a basic knit stitch, I'm going to show you how to do a basic purl stitch, and then I'm going to also show you how to cast off. Remember that in the description box below you can look at one of my previous videos where I show you how to cast on. If you need to go over that, you can just rewind and watch that again, because I'm just going to do that very quickly in this tutorial. So just some basics that I'm going to start with of how to start knitting, because it can be very off-putting. It can be very scary. You perhaps think, oh, I don't know how to cast on. I don't know how to do this. I don't know the difference between. I'm going to try and demystify that a little bit more for you today. So your basics of knitting, what I'm going to show you today is how to just do those very basic stitches. Once you've mastered how to do the knit stitch and the purl stitch, that's really the basics of knitting. And then I can talk more about how to follow a pattern, how you mix those stitches to make those lacy patterns and things like that. They're all the basic knit and purl stitch. We all start at this point. So today I'm going to be using this Stylecraft chunky wool. When you're starting to knit, it's always easier to start with a chunky wool and the biggest knitting needles that you feel comfortable with. So these are 8mm needles that I'm using today, and my needle of preference is the bamboo needle. So you can buy lots of different needles, the metal needles, you can buy plastic needles. I like the bamboo ones. The reason is they're lightweight, they're very comfortable, they're nice to touch, and they have a nice grip so that when you're using the wool, it grips quite nicely, but the wool still slides along it, so you've got lots of flexibility and lots of movement. So they're my preferred needle, and that's what I'm using today. So these are size 8, so they're quite big, and the wool is chunky. And I'm going to show you these two little swatches that I've done here to show you what I'm going to do today. So this little swatch here is I've cast on and just knitted 15 stitches, and I've just knit each row backwards and forwards. And basically, if you think about knitting as the process of transferring the stitches from one needle to the other with your wool, and then that's how it grows, and it can grow very, very quickly. So that swatch, you can see, is the same both sides. And when you just do the knit row and another knit row backwards and forwards in this way, that is a garter stitch. So that's known as garter stitch. And I always think that kind of stitch is nice for if you're making leg warmers or gloves, because it's nice and quite stretchy. And this swatch here is where I've done the sort of basic stocking stitch. So you might find this kind of stitch on a regular, I mean, this is very fine, the cardigan I'm wearing today, but that is just a fine, if you buy something that's fine knit or thick knit, it's usually just a stocking stitch. And that is one row of knit and then another row of purl stitches. And that's why I'm going to show you both of those stitches today, because that gives you this nice stocking stitch. So the front is all neat and in little V's, and then the back is the same as this almost, where it's just the bumpy stitches. And together they make the stocking stitch. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, leave your comments below, and if you press the little bell, then that will let you know each time that I put a new video on, so you get a notification. So let's get knitting. Okay, so I've got my 8mm needles and my chunky wool, and I'm going to start by casting on using my preferred method, which is the thumb method. You can catch up, I'll put in the description box below the YouTube video to how to cast on. And with the thumb method, you get the yarn that you're going to knit with to start with. You make sure you've got that as working yarn in your right hand. So remember, I'm a right-handed knitter, so I'm making sure, this is unusual to be using the wool from the right to start with. So we cast on. Again, if you need a refresh on this, look back at that YouTube video. I'm just going to cast on 15 stitches to show you how to knit and purl stitch today. So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And a good tip to get into when you're learning to knit is to count your stitches often, usually at the end of every row. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. So I've counted wrong, so I've got 16. I'm just going to take one off because it's so easy to miscount when you're knitting. So just always double check your stitches. Can never count too much. So I've got my 15 stitches on my left hand needle now, and I'm going to start the basic knitting stitch. So I use my right hand needle under my arm because that's how I like to knit. Some people knit like this, some people knit like this. It really depends how you feel most comfortable. So it's just trying different ways that feel comfortable to you. So this tail end that we've just used to cast on with is redundant really now. We're just going to keep that out of the way with my left hand because we don't want to use that. We're now using the ball of wool, and just pull it a little just so you're using your working yarn, the yarn that you're going to be working with, so it's not too tight coming off that ball of wool. And we're going to start knitting. So you take your right hand needle and place it under that first loop, that first stitch. So your needles are making a cross, just like this. Then you take your yarn and you take the yarn over that bottom right hand needle and pull it so it's comfortable. So tension is quite important when you're knitting. Don't worry too much about tension at this stage, just as an absolute beginner, but it just wants to feel comfortable, not too tight, but not too sloppy either. So just keep it nice and comfortable with this right hand. And then you pull this right hand bottom needle up through that stitch until it's across the top of the left hand needle, and then slip it off the needle. And that is your first knit stitch. So at this stage, it looks a little bit strange there because the first row is always a little bit different because it's from your cast on row. So just bear with it and then you'll see how it comes together. So let's knit this next stitch. So we put the right hand needle under through that stitch until the needles are crossed. Put the yarn over that bottom needle, pull the needle through and up, and take that stitch off. And that's your second knit stitch. And then we keep going. So go under again, yarn over, pull the needle towards you and take that needle up and cast it off. Now you'll notice, and it's quite important to just watch the movement of the needles, because the needles are obviously doing all the work with your hands. And the wool, the only movement you're doing on the wool is bringing this yarn over. So there's lots of elements. There's your hands, there's the needles, and there's the wool. And then they're all working together. I always think it's a bit like learning to drive. When you start learning to drive, you're learning to steer, use the brakes, change gear, and they all feel really complicated because you're thinking about them all in isolation. But then once you get it, it just comes together as one natural thing, one natural movement. Same with knitting. So you're just taking the first step by step, and I'll show you what my hands and what the needles and what the wool is doing at each stage. So we take this right hand needle, go under that stitch until the needles make a cross, yarn over that lower needle in the right, pull that needle through. So now both the needles are moving at this stage, so they're moving against each other. Pull the bottom one up, so that's now on the top. And at that stage, your wool is still attached to both needles. They're still attached, loosely, but they are still attached. And then you take that top one to the right, and it drops off that stitch at the end. And that's your knit stitch. So one more, slowly up, take it across and off. Underneath the stitch, pull the yarn over, pull it towards you and off. Underneath, yarn over, pull it towards you and off. Underneath, yarn over, pull towards you and off. Underneath, yarn over, pull it towards you and off. And as you can see, once you get into that rhythm, it's really quite methodical in how you do it. You can see it's just almost like a machine. You can see how my hands and the needles and the yarn are all moving together till I get to the end of that row. And there's my stitches. So now I swap the needles onto the other hands. So my empty needle is now in my right hand and my needle with the stitches on is in my left. And again, just count the stitches, get into that habit. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15. So now I'm on row 2 and we just carry on before. Underneath, yarn over, pull it towards you and off. And let's just get into that nice smooth rhythm. And when you're knitting, as you're knitting, you'll notice that I'm shuffling up these stitches on the left towards the point, towards the end of the needle most of the time. Now when you've got a lot of stitches on that left hand needle, I sometimes stop and then sort of hutch them up a little bit because I like these stitches here quite close to the point of the needle. You can see how it tapers off. I like them just before it starts to taper. Underneath, yarn over, pull it through, and just notice the movement of the needles together, how they work together. So it's not one or individual movements, it's one slick, smooth movement. You turn it over and then you can see that that row then has got the little bumps, same as the other row. The front and back, because we're doing all knit stitch, will look the same once we've finished. And we start again. Just knitting, in, over, out, in, over, off, in, over and off. This is where the bamboo needles really come into their own when you're knitting. You're using them, how they just have that really nice grip, that they're not too slippy, because if you're using two needles, the metal needles I especially find rub together each other. They give me a bit of a cringy feeling when they rub together, whereas the bamboo needles just, they're really smooth, but they've got a nice grip and they hold the wool nicely, and they're just so comfortable in your hands, because when you're knitting you can sit for hours. You think you're sitting for hours potentially in this position, so you need to be comfortable. Now see how that wool now is tight on the ball, so I'm just going to pull some out. That's your working yarn to keep it loose so that you're not dragging off that ball of wool. Here we are at the end of this small block, and I've done 10 rows in just the knit stitch, and you can see both sides look exactly the same, all your little bubbles like little waves. And now I'm going to cast off this block, which basically means I'm going to take all these stitches off the needle, so it's just going to be a little standalone block. Here we go. So to cast off, it's quite simple really. You're just doing very similar to what we've just done with the knit stitch, and then you're just looping each stitch off one at a time. So let's start. So I put the needle under, yarn over, and take that first stitch off just as we have before. Second stitch, just a normal knit stitch. And then this time we're going to take this first stitch here with your left hand needle, take the needle under that stitch and loop it up and over that first, or that second stitch, sorry, and take it off. So then you're always left with just one stitch. You knit one stitch from the left to the right hand needle, and then you do a yarn over, pass it over it's called, pass over stitch, which then takes it over and casts off. So I'll show you again. So take the needle under just as you have with a normal knit stitch, yarn over and knit, take it off just as you have before, but with your left hand needle now doing all the work. You take the left hand needle under that first stitch and pick it up, and you're taking it over, passing it over that stitch, and you drop it off the end. Pass over, that's called. If you see on a pattern, that's usually PSSO, means pass it over that stitch. So same again, normal knit stitch, which you now know how to do. Take that left hand needle and pass that top stitch over that second one and drop it off. And that is casting off. You know, we hear these skills, don't we? We hear these terms, I think, when you're learning to knit. Oh, how do you cast off? And it can be a real concern, and people go, oh, I don't know how to do that, I don't know how to do that. But actually, it's much more simple than you think. If you've got the right tools, take your time. And once you can knit, you can then very easily cast off, because this knit stitch exactly the same, and all you're doing is passing that first stitch over the second and dropping it off, and that's it. That's casting off. Nothing to be scared of. So we'll just finish off with these last few stitches. And as I said earlier, when you're casting off, for me anyway, the left hand needle's doing all the work. See how the right hand needle is just staying same, and that left hand and your left hand needle's doing all the work. It's funny, isn't it, how I'm predominant, you know, I'm a right hander, but on this occasion my left hand's actually doing more work. It's always strange. And that's the last one. So when you get to the last one, put that left hand needle down, and then you can pull. Make sure you've got plenty there of wool on that slip stitch. Remove the other needle, and you've got a really nice finished off cast off stitch. And then I'm going to cut the yarn, and just as we do when we do a slip stitch to cast on, we do another slip stitch, but this time pull it tight, and that will finish off and nicely secure that block. And there is your block of garter stitch, just your knit, plain knit stitch, and looks lovely. That's really nice for making baby blankets or little squares that you can then knit together or sew together to make a nice blanket, just in knit stitch. Okay, so I've already cast on, and I've done the first row of knit stitch. So when you're doing the purl, remember that it's alternate rows, knit one, purl one. That's where that term comes from. So I've already knit that first row, as you've already seen me do, and now I'm going to purl this next row. And I always think it's important to know that when you see these bumps in the stitches, then that reminds me that if I'm doing a stocking stitch, which is what I'm going to show you now, it's where the purl stitch comes in, that's when you do a purl stitch, when the stitch that's already on the left hand needle has got that little bump, and that will become clear as I start knitting. So very similar, the purl stitch to the knit. You just, instead of you going into that first stitch with this right hand needle like this, you're going in the opposite direction, so to the left. So take the needle under that yarn, and then this right hand needle goes under the stitch, but this time to the left. So that's your knit, this way is your purl. So we go under the yarn there on the left hand needle, take the yarn over, pull towards you just gently to keep that tension nice and comfortable, and then drop the needle underneath, the right one underneath, so you're making that cross again, and take that needle and pull that stitch off, and that's your purl stitch. So I'll do this row really slowly so you can see each one. And again, take notice of the needles moving, my hands moving, and where the wool is, to get used to the rhythm. So take that right hand needle under the yarn over the needle, pull it back towards you, careful not to drop that stitch off the needle, and then take it off to the right. Underneath, yarn over, pull it towards you, and drop. It's always a little bit scary, that and drop. It feels like you're losing the stitches, but you're not. You're just moving them. What we're doing when we're knitting is taking the stitches from the left, if you're a right hander, to the right. You're just taking them over, and with each row you're just adding more yarn and making it bigger so it grows. So take the yarn under, the needle under, yarn over, pull towards you and off. Yarn under, needle under, yarn over, towards you and off. Needle under, yarn over, towards you and off. And just watch the rhythm of the whole needles, wool and hands together now. Off. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And so on. Again, it's quite methodical, quite therapeutic, just the same natural rhythm. Now, once you've purled that row, this is where it starts to look very different from the garter stitch. Remember, this is stocking stitch. So this is knitting a row, purling a row, and you can see how that's forming those little V shapes that you would tend to get when you see a jumper or a standard cardigan or something like that, just your standard stitching. And then on the back it looks just like this block I made earlier that was just the knitting stitches. So you can see the difference now. This is more of a formal stitch, I would say. So on this row we're now going to do another row of knit stitches, so I'll do those quickly. And again, just a little tip, you know, because when you start knitting and you might put it down to go and do something, when you then pick it up it might look a little bit strange and you might think, oh, what row am I on now? When this tail yarn is at the end here towards you, at the end of this where the pointy end is, that is your right side. And here you can see that that is a knit stitch, and I know I'm knitting that row because there aren't any bumps. So remember what I said before, when I turn it round to do the next row, the purl row, there's the bumps, and that's how you just get used to it. So this is the right side. If you were to make a jumper, this would be the side that's showing. And I'm just going to knit. So I've already shown you how to do that, so I'm going to do those quite quickly. Just knit that row just as we did before. Push the needle, push the stitches so they're nearer the end of the needle. It just depends what you're comfortable with. That's why it's all about practice and practice and practice. Okay, so that's my knit row. And then when I turn that round, you see how these have got the bumps. So I know that I'm now on a purl row. This is the wrong side. So put the needle under that purl stitch to drop it off, and there. So I'll do this row quite slowly so you can see it again in more detail, and then I'm just going to knit and purl, knit a row, purl a row, knit a row, purl a row, until I've got 10 rows as I did before, and then I'll show you how to cast off with the purl stitch, and that's that block finished as well. Okay, so now I've got my short little block of stocking stitch, knitting and purling, and I'm now on the row that would next be my purl row, but we're going to cast off. So this is how to cast off with the purl stitch. So we take the first stitch and take the yarn, the needle under the yarn, just as we did with the normal purl row. Do 1 stitch and 2, and then this time this is a little bit trickier because it's you're sort of all fingers and hands, because you've got the yarn here, your working yarn in front of you, and the 2 stitches on this right hand needle, and you've got to take that one. Remember, it's that passover stitch that you're going to pick that first one up and pass it over the second and take it off. So it's exactly the same as casting off with knit, but this time the stitches are, you know, it's all here in front of you with this working yarn, so it's just a little bit fiddlier. So take that needle under, do your purl stitch as normal, then with those 2 stitches just pass that one over the second stitch, and you just continue. Again, it's that scary kind of, oh, I'm losing a stitch. You're not, you're just allowing it to go because you're casting off, because otherwise if you didn't cast off you'd just be knitting forever. So you're just letting those stitches drop off the needle, that right hand needle, so that you can finish your piece of knitting. And a few more to go. I always find the casting off in purl just that bit more, bit slower. Just take your time. There's never any rush, I always think, with knitting. It's a hobby, it's a pleasure, it's relaxing. It's not always relaxing, you know, if you go wrong and you've got to pull things out, but that's just part of the process. It's not the end of the world, it's just wool at the end of the day. Just enjoy it and try it. So we're on the last couple of stitches now, so that's that one, and then the last one we're just going to cast off there, and then the same as before, we're going to pull that yarn a little, put both the needles down, chop that yarn off, and then pull that through to make a knot as a slip stitch. And there you are, and that's how you've cast off. Leaves that really nice, looks like a row of plaited wool, doesn't it? So that is your stocking stitch block, where you've done one row of knit, one row of purl, and that's the effect it makes. And then when you compare them together, you can see the difference. That's the garter stitch knitting, and this one is purl and knit, and that's your stocking stitch. Okay, so thanks for watching today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave your comments. And also, don't forget you can rewind and watch this video at different points, just if you need to recap something or want a little bit more attention to that part of the video. And thanks for watching again. Great to see you, and we'll see you next time.